Picture this. It's a typical rainy afternoon in London. The streets are slick, umbrellas are up, and the massive hands on that iconic clock face at the Palace of Westminster are inching toward the top of the hour. But then, nothing. The minute hand just freezes, right in the middle of a stroke. The hour passes without a single sound. So what if the clock stopped forever? And I don't mean just paused for some quick maintenance or delayed for a few hours. I mean stopped permanently. Imagine standing right down there by the River Thames, looking up at that tower, just instinctively waiting for that deep, resonating chime that you and literally millions of others expect to hear. But it never comes. That kind of absence wouldn't just be quiet, It would create an almost physical sensation, a feeling that something deeply, deeply important has suddenly gone missing from the world. Now, normally, London's daily life is this living, breathing symphony, right? You've got traffic, sirens, other church bells, footsteps, massive crowds. But take Big Ben away from that mix, and you are left with this incredibly uncanny silence. There's no chime marking the hour, no echo carrying across the river. It's like a frozen heartbeat. Because Big Ben really anchors the entire city's soundscape, and without it, the environment instantly feels totally incomplete, even though, visually, nothing has changed at all. Let's get right into Section 1, the sudden silence. Because while the tower still stands tall, its meaning changes the absolute second that permanent silence sets in. You'd see commuters, tourists, and local shop owners all reacting. First, suddenly realizing that this isn't just a missed hour, it's an immediate, jarring shift in their everyday reality. As the sources point out, a familiar piece of the national story had broken. The first real impact here, it's entirely psychological. Big Ben is way more than just a machine. It's a massive part of Britain's emotional geography. People rely on it for this sense of continuity. Actually, we really don't realize how much of our own personal stability depends on these ordinary, reliable background things until they just vanish. The place looks exactly the same, sure, but the feeling, the whole atmosphere is completely different. And that psychological impact leads us straight into Section 2, diagnosing a cultural crisis. This is where the practical fallout really begins. Because the world wouldn't just look at this as, say, a broken gear or a snapped wire. Oh no. They would instantly interpret this mechanical failure as a major symbolic crisis. The immediate reaction would be absolutely staggering. The media explosion would happen instantly. Headlines wouldn't just report on a broken clock, they'd be debating a full-blown heritage crisis. Social media would just flood with clips of the silent tower, memes, and, of course, wild conspiracy theories. Some folks would definitely speculate it's some sort of cover-up, while others would project this metaphor for national decline onto it, like it's a sign that the old world and its traditions are just slipping away. The silence basically becomes a blank canvas for society's biggest anxieties. But behind all that public noise, engineers would be facing a super high-pressure reality. They'd have to go through a rigorous diagnostic process. First, checking for wear and tear on a historic system that has been pushed incredibly hard for well over a century. Then, investigating sudden power issues. And finally, assessing for catastrophic structural failure. The pressure to restore it would be just enormous, because every passing hour of silence makes the whole event feel more permanent, elevating it from a routine maintenance issue to a downright national emergency. And we have to talk about how this affects the very fabric of the city's economy and its overall appeal. The visual landmark is still there, right? And the historic atmosphere remains, but that crucial third element, the living sound, is lost. Tourists love symbols that actually feel alive. A permanently silent Big Ben would change the entire vibe around Westminster from one of awe to one of disappointments and really loss. People who traveled halfway across the world imagining they'd hear that chime would now only experience it as a memory, totally changing the atmospheric experience of the city. Which brings us to Section 3, the heritage debate. Because once that initial shock wears off and the permanence of the stoppage really sets in, an intense public debate would inevitably spark up over exactly how to handle a permanently broken national icon. We'd immediately see two deeply human preservation instincts clashing here. On one side, you have the urge to preserve continuity, so rebuilding the clock's heart, replacing the internal components, basically forcing the rhythm to continue no matter how much modern machinery it actually takes. On the other side, you have the urge to preserve authenticity, which means accepting the silence and leaving the original, broken pieces totally untouched as a monument to lost motion. It's a huge question. Do you preserve the object as it was, or do you preserve the meaning it holds? There's a great quote from the sources that hits the nail on the head here. We do not always grieve objects for what they are, we grieve them for what they hold. Think about it. Big Ben is a clock that has witnessed wars, massive celebrations, political upheavals, and generations of change. The real emotional weight of this debate comes from the fact that it has stood as a symbol of order through all of that history. If it stopped, we wouldn't just be grieving a broken mechanism, we'd be grieving the shared collective memory it holds. And just think about the practical disruption to our shared rituals. Like what happens to New Year's Eve? Big Ben is literally the focal point for national countdowns and public celebrations. Its silence would be felt most sharply precisely when it is expected to speak. Imagine the uncanny disruption of a perfectly silent clock at midnight. It would feel as if the entire nation had lost its familiar heartbeat at the exact moment of renewal. Kind of eerie, right? Let's zoom out a bit now to our final section, Section 4, the meaning of stillness. This is where we look at the philosophical layer of this explainer and what this frozen clock actually reveals about the human condition and our rather fragile relationship with reality. When we dive into the philosophy of time, we realize clocks are these brilliant tools that help us organize our daily lives for sure. But they also serve a secondary, totally psychological purpose. They mask the relentless movement of time. They let us pretend time is stable and regular. But a stopped clock, it forces an immediate, really uncomfortable awareness of our own schedules, our aging, and our mortality. It turns time from this vague, background abstraction into a heavy, unavoidable presence right there in the room with you. And this stillness would be interpreted vastly differently across society. School children, for example, might see it purely as a fascinating lesson in history and engineering. Older Londoners, they might feel a genuine, profound sense of grief for a stable, familiar past that is just suddenly gone. And artists would immediately jump on this, turning the silent clock into powerful metaphors for memory, endurance, and change. The sheer ambiguity of the silence makes it completely unforgettable. The sources highlight this perfectly. A frozen clock reminds us otherwise. It says that even grand, beautiful, expensive, historically important things can fail. You know, we often walk around living as if our institutions and traditions will just continue unchanged forever. But this stoppage, it's a profound realization that absolutely nothing is immune to change. It's a stark, necessary reminder to appreciate living heritage while it still moves, rather than taking it for granted every single day. And this brings us to a wonderful, almost poetic irony. Stillness actually creates more memory than motion. The clock is famous for marking time, sure, but if it stopped forever, it would probably be talked about for longer than many moving things ever are. People would remember exactly where they were when they heard it stopped. They'd remember the stark image of the silent tower. It essentially compresses all that emotion and history into a single, frozen image that stays with us far, far longer. Which brings us to our final lingering question for you. How would you experience time differently if your city's heartbeat stopped forever? This explainer isn't just about some hypothetical mechanical failure. It's a reflection on the fragile living traditions we all just walk past every single day. History isn't a frozen museum piece, guys. It's alive, it's maintained, and it requires our attention. So the next time you hear a familiar bell chime or see a local landmark, take a moment to really listen while the bells still ring.